cold.
Good morning, church family. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Sunday morning Bible class at the Broad Street Church of Christ. Sorry for the delay. I had some technical difficulties, but we got over that. For the last 5 months, we've been seeking to answer the question, does archaeology support the Bible? Last week I was out sick, so 2 weeks ago we concluded our studies with Genesis chapter 37, and we moved on to chapter 38. We discussed the biblical history and the archaeological findings of the city of Adullam, and we found that the archaeology supported the Bible's description of Adullam. We left off with verse 1. Verses 2 through 5 tell us that Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man and married her. The Bible does not provide her name. She provides Judah with 3 sons named Onan, and Shelah. Verse 6 states that Judah found a wife for his firstborn named Tamar. But verse 7 states that was wicked in the sight of God, and God put him to death. Verse 8 tells us that Judah asked his second son, Onan, to sleep with his sister-in-law so that the older brother could have an heir. And this is in keeping with Jewish custom at the time. However, in verse 10, Onan was also wicked, so God put him to death as well, leaving Tamar without an heir. In verse 11, Judah tells Tamar that she should go back to her father's house and live as a widow until his third son, Shelah, grows up. And she did as she was told, and that brings us to verse 12. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah, to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira the Adullamite went with him. So Judah was staying at Adullam at this point, and he's about to go to Timnah. Genesis 38:12 provides us with one place name, and that is Timnah. In Hebrew, Timnah can mean either restraint or territory. There are 2 towns named Timnah in Israel. There is a Timnah in the south of Israel near the Gulf of Aqaba, where King Solomon mined copper. And this Timnah is not mentioned in the Bible, and we're not going to talk about it anymore today. The Timnah mentioned in the Bible near Adullam is known to archaeologists as Tel Biktak. This is the same map that I've showed you earlier, only this time I've added the location of the biblical city of Timnah. Timnah being here, Adullam is here, Hebron, where Jacob and the other brothers are staying, is here. Remember that last week Judah moved up to Adullam, found himself a wife, now has 3 sons, and he's on his way to Timnah. Tel Biktak, lies about 5 miles northeast of Adullam and about 25 miles west from Jerusalem. Timnah is mentioned 10 times in the Old Testament. Timnah is mentioned 3 times in Genesis chapter 38 in connection with Judah and his daughter-in-law Tamar. This is during the patriarchal era. Timnah is mentioned twice in Joshua chapter 15 as originally being assigned to the tribe of Judah. Timnah is then mentioned in chapter 19 as being reassigned from the tribe of Judah to the tribe of Dan. This is during the era of the Israeli conquest of Canaan. Timnah is mentioned 3 times in Judges chapter 14 as the site where Samson found a Philistine woman to be his wife. And this was during the Judges era. Timnah is mentioned once more in 2 Chronicles chapter 28 as part of God's judgment of the kingdom of Judah. The Philistines raid the towns of the Shephelah. That's this coastal region here. These are mountains, and this is the coastal region. That's known as the Shephelah. So the Philistines raided the towns of the Shephelah and the Judean foothills and captured and occupied them, including Timnah. And this was during the divided monarchy era. As we discussed 2 weeks ago with Adullam, Timnah is mentioned as one of the 46 Judean cities conquered during the military campaign of the Assyrian king Sennacherib in 701 BC during the divided monarchy era. Timnah, along with several other towns, Jericho, Emmaus, Beth Horon, Bethel, Parathon, and Tephon, was fortified by the Greek general Bacchides during the Maccabean revolt of April 160 BC. A garrison of soldiers was placed in each of these fortified cities. This is near the end of the Hasmonean era. These battle preparations were documented in the book of 1 Maccabees, chapter 9, and in Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, volume 12, chapter 11. This is a list of the archaeological studies done at Tel Biktak. Between 1873 and 74, French archaeologist Charles Clermont-Ganneau conducted several surveys in western Palestine to include Tel Biktak. He published his findings in his 1896 book entitled Archaeological Researches in Palestine During the Years 1873-1874. 100 years later, between 1977 and 1979, American archaeologist George L. Kelm, then with the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, conducted 3 seasons of excavations at Tel Biktak. In 1981, George Kelm returns, but now with the Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he's joined by Israeli archaeologist Amiha Mazar of the Hebrew University. And they conducted excavations until 1989. This is an aerial view of Tel Biktak, biblical Timnah, and the Sorek River. So the Tel is this approximately square thing here, and this is the river Sorek. And the whole valley here is called the Sorek Valley. There have been no excavations in the last 35 years, and this site has obviously overgrown with vegetation. Most of the excavations were along this northeast side here and the eastern side here. When I'm done, this slide will be a comparison of the biblical history of Timnah and the archaeological findings at Tel Biktak. The Bible is silent about Timnah before the patriarchal era. Archaeology has found no evidence of human activity prior to the patriarchal era. The Bible, in Genesis chapter 38, tells us that Timnah was a settlement at the time of Judah in the patriarchal area. Archaeology tells us that Timnah was first built during this era. The settlement was a 10-acre square surrounded by a 30-foot-high earthen rampart that enclosed the site. The rampart was surrounded on the outside with a wide moat that has since been filled in. The The sides of the settlement were oriented to the compass points. A gate was present at the north wall. Pottery sherds found at the site indicate that Timnah was a Canaanite settlement during the patriarchal period. The Bible, in Joshua chapter 15, tells us that Timnah was originally assigned to the tribe of Judah, but in chapter 19, Timnah is reassigned to the tribe of Dan. This is during the Israeli conquest era. Archaeology tells us that the Tel Timnah was occupied by Canaanites at the time of the Israeli conquest of Canaan. The earthen rampart that served as walls during the previous periods was amplified with a stone wall about 4 foot thick and about 5 feet high. Unlike the previous period, the floors of the inner buildings of this period were plastered. The buildings of this era all demonstrated a destruction by fire. Remnants of the wooden ceilings and wooden support beams were blackened like charcoal. 2 human skeletons were found under the burnt debris, providing additional evidence of a violent end to the building. 1 skeleton laid in the center of the hall, while the other laid in the entrance to the hall among the fallen bricks of the second floor. Canaanite pottery and domestic objects littered this layer. Many storage vessels and cooking pots were found on the first floor. 5 of the storage jars contained large quantities of carbonized grain, while another contained almonds still in their shell. This suggests that that fire probably occurred in the spring time frame after the harvest. In the fall after the harvest. Upstairs in the domestic area, many bronze arrowheads, mace heads, spearheads, chisels, and other metal objects were found. Jewelry was also found upstairs. 5 Canaanite cylinder seals and 2 Egyptian seals were also found upstairs. The Canaanite seals were easily dated to the 14th century BC. One of the Egyptian seals contained a scarab with a cartouche of Amenhotep III, who ruled during the 14th century BC. The other Egyptian seal contained a cartouche of his queen, Tai. This dates the debris to the time of the Israeli conquest. Since Timnah is not listed in the book of Joshua as one of the cities destroyed by fire during the Israeli conquest, it is likely that Timnah was destroyed by the Philistines when they took the city from the Canaanites sometime between the conquest and the Judges era. The Bible in Judges chapter 14 tells us that Timnah is the site where Samson found a Philistine woman to be his wife during the Judges era. Verse 4 tells us that the Philistines were ruling over this area at this time. Archaeology tells us that the walls that were destroyed during the previous era were rebuilt. All of the pottery found in this layer was Philistine pottery, indicating that the Canaanites abandoned the city after its destruction. Also found were Philistine jewelry and Philistine cylinder seals. Large baking ovens were found dating to this period. Philistines appear to have occupied the city until sometime during the United Monarchy period, when they abandoned the city. The Bible does not specifically mention Timnah during the United Monarchy era. However, 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles tells us that King David defeats the Philistine army twice. The second time, he pursues them from the valley of Rephaim, all the way to the city of Gezer. The city of Gezer lies just 4 miles north of Timnah, so it's likely that he conquered them here at Timnah as well. Archaeology tells us that the Philistines abandoned Timnah during the United Monarchy era. A Jewish population occupied the city and fortified the city with military towers and built up the gate complexes, making it easier to defend the city. Jewish pottery found in this layer was dated to no later than the 10th century BC or the time of King David. This appears to be the first time a Jewish population occupied the city. The Bible, in 2 Chronicles chapter 28, tells us that during the time of King Ahaz of Judah, the Philistines raided towns and foothills in the southern regions of Judah. Timnah is listed among the cities, towns, and villages conquered and occupied by the Philistines. In 2 Kings chapter 18, King Hezekiah, Ahaz's son, drives out the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory. Although Timnah is not specifically mentioned, it would have been included in the area cleared out by King Hezekiah. Archaeology tells us that the United Monarchy era structure was destroyed during the divided monarchy period. The old gate complex on the north was replaced by a new gate complex on the east. A new ramp was built leading from the south up to the new eastern gate. Pottery jars found at this level have a distinct mark indicating that these jars were distributed by King Hezekiah to his military outposts in preparation of an invasion by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, which occurred in 701 BC. A destruction layer is dated to this time frame. A second destruction layer was discovered that dates to King Hosea's time frame, and the city appears to have been abandoned ever since. So in summary, archaeology supports the Bible's claims about Timnah. Are there any questions about Timnah before we move on? So either I've thoroughly confused you or it was clear, crystal clear, one or the other. Okay, we will move on. So in the next verses, Genesis chapter 38, verses 13 and 14, when Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Anaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that, though Shelah had grown up, she had not been given to him as a wife. So Genesis 38, verses 13 through 14, provide two place names, Timnah, which we just talked about, and a new place name of Anaim. In Hebrew, Anaim means eyes of perception, or eyes of judgment, or eyes of opinion. Our English equivalent might be the eyes of the beholder. Anaim is mentioned 3 times in the Old Testament. It's mentioned twice in Genesis chapter 38 in relation to Judah and his daughter-in-law Tamar. This is during the patriarchal period. Anaim, this time spelled E-N-A-M, is also mentioned in Joshua chapter 15, verse 34, as one of the towns in the western foothills assigned to the tribe of Judah. This same region was later reassigned to the tribe of Dan in Joshua chapter 19, but Anaim was not specifically mentioned here. Archaeologists have proposed several candidate locations as the site of the biblical Anaim, and there is little consensus among archaeologists. From what I can tell, none of the proposed sites meet the Bible's requirements of being on a road between Adullam and Timnah. And since there's no archaeological data to review, I'll move on to the next verse with the place name, unless there's some questions about Anaim. Okay. So we left off with chapter 38, verses 13 through 14. Judah ends up sleeping with Tamar, not realizing that she's his daughter-in-law. She becomes pregnant and has twins, Perez and Zerah. Later in the Bible, Perez becomes the ancestor to King David and therefore to Joseph, husband to Mary, mother to Jesus. There are no other place names in the remainder of chapter 38, and in fact, there are no other place names that we haven't already talked about until you get to chapter 45. Many events occur in the 7 intervening chapters, and I'm not going to go over them in detail, but I will summarize so that I can set the stage for chapter 45. In chapter 37, Joseph is sold into slavery to Potiphar, the Pharaoh's captain of the guard. In chapter 39, the Lord is with Joseph, and he does well by Potiphar. Potiphar recognizes that the Lord is with Joseph, and Potiphar puts Joseph in charge of his household and all that he had. Potiphar's wife also notices the young Joseph and wishes to sleep with him, which Joseph refuses. The scorned wife then accuses Joseph of trying to force himself on her. Potiphar then puts Joseph in his house jail along with Pharaoh's other prisoners. While in prison, the Lord is with Joseph, and the warden takes notice of Joseph. He recognizes that the Lord is with Joseph, and he puts him in charge of the other prisoners. In modern day language, we would say that the warden makes Joseph the head trustee. In chapter 40, the Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker offends the Pharaoh. Pharaoh then places them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard where Joseph is staying, where he's confined. After some time, the cupbearer and the baker dream during the night. They are unable to interpret their dreams, and they are dejected. Joseph asks them why they're sad, and they tell him that they had dreams, but no one can tell them how to interpret the dreams. Joseph realizes that God can interpret the dreams, so he asks them to tell him their dreams. Joseph, with God's help, is able to interpret the dreams. Joseph asks the cupbearer that when his dream comes true, which is that he's going to be released, to remember Joseph in prison and to mention him favorably to the Pharaoh. The cupbearer is released, as Joseph says that he would be, but the cupbearer doesn't mention Joseph to the Pharaoh, and that brings us to chapter 41. In chapter 41, opens up stating that 2 full years later, Pharaoh has 2 dreams while sleeping. He's troubled by his dreams, and he sends for all the magicians and the wise men of Egypt, but no one can interpret his dreams. The chief cupbearer then remembers Joseph and tells Pharaoh of how Joseph had successfully interpreted his and the baker's dreams. The Pharaoh sends for Joseph and asks him to interpret the dreams. Joseph tells Pharaoh that he can't do it, but that God can. Pharaoh tells Joseph the 2 dreams, and Joseph tells Pharaoh that there will be 7 years of good harvest, followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph then recommends that Pharaoh collect and store 1/5 of the harvest each of the 7 years of abundant harvest to be used during the 7 years of famine. Pharaoh sees that the plan is good, and he puts Joseph in charge of all of Egypt, second only to himself. Pharaoh then gives Joseph the daughter of a high priest as a wife. Verse 46 says that Joseph was 30 years old when he entered into the service of the Pharaoh. Joseph collects and stores the harvest according to his plan, and during these 7 years of abundant harvest, he has 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Chapter 41 ends with the start of the famine. Joseph begins to sell the grain to the Egyptians and to neighboring countries. Chapter 42 begins with Jacob, who's at Mamre near Hebron, sending his 10 of his sons to Egypt to buy grain. Jacob keeps Benjamin behind, Benjamin being Joseph's brother. When the 10 brothers reach Egypt to buy grain, they bow down to Joseph, just as his earlier dream from chapter 37. The brothers do not recognize Joseph, Joseph accuses the brothers of being spies, and they deny it. They state that they are the sons of one man back in Canaan. They state that their youngest brother remained with their father. Joseph continues to accuse them of being spies, but he tells them that to prove that they are honest men, they'll be sent back home with the grain that they purchase, but one of the brothers must remain in Egypt until they return with their younger brother. At that point, Joseph will release the brother, and all of the brothers will be free to trade in Egypt. Joseph holds on to Simeon and releases the other brothers with food and provisions for their journey. The brothers return to their fathers and tell them what had happened. Jacob initially refuses to allow them to return to Egypt with Benjamin, leaving Simeon in Egypt. And that ends chapter 42. Chapter 43 begins with the famine continuing to be severe. Jacob and his family eat up all the grain that they purchased from Egypt. So Jacob tells his sons to go back to Egypt to buy more grain. Initially, Jacob doesn't want to send Benjamin with his brothers, but Judah guarantees Benjamin's safety. Jacob relents and allows the brothers to take Benjamin with them. When Joseph sees his brothers with Benjamin, he orders the steward of his house to prepare lunch for them and the brothers. Joseph releases Simeon and has lunch with his brothers. At this point, the brothers still don't recognize Joseph, and that ends chapter 43. Chapter 44 begins with Joseph preparing to send the brothers back to Jacob. He instructs his steward to pack as much food as the brothers can carry, along with the silver that they brought to purchase the food. He also instructed the steward to place his silver cup in Benjamin's sack along with the grain. The next morning, the brothers were sent on their way back to Jacob. However, before long, Joseph sends his steward to catch up with the brothers and to search for the stolen cup. He finds the cup in Benjamin's sack, right where he placed it, and they all return back to the city. Joseph then demands that Benjamin remain in Egypt as his slave, allowing the other brothers to return to their father. Judah offers to remain in Egypt in Benjamin's place if Joseph were to allow Benjamin to return to his father. And that ends chapter 44. Chapter 45 begins with Joseph revealing his true identity to his brothers. Verse 6 states that the famine had been going on for 2 years at this point, and Joseph expects the famine to go on for another 5 years. He asks his brother to return to Jacob and bring him back to Egypt, where Joseph can take care of him and his brothers. And that brings us up to verse 10. Pardon me. Genesis chapter 45, verse 10. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all that you have. So Genesis chapter 45, verse 10 gives us one place name called the region of Goshen. The origin of the name Goshen is not definitively known, and etymologists argue about its origin. In Hebrew, the term Goshen refers to a welled water area. In Egyptian, the term Goshen means a well-watered land. This certainly describes the Eastern Nile region, a delta region. Note that the Bible calls Goshen a region and not a city. The Bible refers to this same area in 3 other ways. In Genesis chapter 47, verse 10, this same area is called the district of Ramses. 3 times in Genesis chapter 47, this area is referred to as the best part of the land. In Psalm 78, the area is referred to twice as the region of Zon, which is the area around the Egyptian city of Zon, known by the Greeks as Tanis. There are two Goshens mentioned in the Old Testament. The Egyptian region of Goshen is mentioned 11 times in the books of Genesis and Exodus. The Canaanite Goshen is mentioned 3 times in the book of Joshua, and I won't be talking about the Canaanite Goshen today. This is a satellite image taken by NASA on July 19, 2004, so about 20 years ago. As you can see, the lower River Nile Delta is the major green area on the map. The rest of it is desert, nothing growing there. You can see why it is described as the best part of the land and why Joseph would want his family to settle there. The region of Goshen, also known as the District of Ramses or the region of Zon, is the eastern half of the lower Nile River Delta. So the region of Goshen is this half right here. It's bounded by various branches of the Nile. There's like 5 branches of Nile at this point. There's one branch that goes almost straight, and so Goshen starts here. The southern boundary is this canal right here, and the eastern boundary is this canal and wall here. So all of this is the region of Goshen. While I'm here, earlier we've talked about the wilderness of Shur. There's an ancient wall that was built, I believe, by the 12th dynasty in Egypt along this canal right here, and that was to keep foreigners out. There were military posts here to help regulate traffic back and forth. So this is the border of Shur, and the wilderness of Shur is this area here. It's north of this little mountain right here, mountain range. So it's this area of desert here. And we've talked about Shur several times in Genesis. Any questions? That's a great question, and I'm about to answer that question. So I showed you a satellite map to show you how green that area was and to give you a sense of where Goshen is. This is a map, I like to call it a cartoon map, if you will. Goshen is a region and not a city. I put this map up there to show you some of the cities in the region of Goshen that are cited in the books of Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers. And the first city I want to show you is this one here, Zon. The Greeks call it Tanis, and this is not where Joseph was. Okay? This was a primary capital later during the united and divided monarchy, and it's mentioned in the Bible in reference to that time period. Next city I want to show you is this one here. This is Ramses. It's also the city of Avaris. So I'm going to talk about Avaris and Ramses next week. This is where Joseph was. Well, this is where Joseph settled Jacob. City of Avaris. This city here is the city of Pithom. Ramses and Pithom are the 2 store cities that Exodus chapter 1 verses 3 and a few other places say that the Israelites built store cities as slaves for the Egyptian. And these are the 2 store cities that are mentioned in the Bible. I'm going to talk a lot about Avaris and Ramses next week. This is the same city divided by 2 time periods. Okay? The first city was Avaris, the second one was Ramses. This last city is Sukkot, and it's mentioned as part of the Exodus. The the book of Exodus tells us that the Exodus started at Ramses, they went towards Sukkot, and then they crossed and went over into the Sinai Peninsula.
And this is all that little green spot that you showed us in the previous map.
Yeah. So most of this part right here was not there at the time of Joseph and that. In fact, the coastline at the time would have been, this was a port city during the United Monarchy. So all of this came after that. Goshen starts here with this branch of the Nile, and it's all of this area. This is a canal, and this is a series of canals. So this is the area of Goshen.
So that part wasn't there, that landmass.
So the Nile flows from the south to the north, and it's bringing mud and silt and whatever with you, and over thousands of years, this border is increasing. Tanis, during the United Monarchy period, was a port city. You can see now that it's inland, but there is evidence there of ships, a port where ships came in. Today, this is almost completely covered now, and this is a lake. In fact, it's labeled as Tannic Lake, even though at the stage of this map, it's still open. Other questions? Since we've had the first bell, maybe this is a good place to stop, and next week I'll get into the city of Zon and talk about the biblical history and the archaeology of Zon. Any questions? So we'll talk about Zon next week, and we'll see how far we can get into the cities of Avaris and Ramses. So at this point, we'll get ready for our worship service. Thank you.